How are you guys identifying what should be done? Like people coming to you, or you reaching out, or how are you making sense of your mission there?
Oh my. Well, you have an agenda. The agenda is determined by Prishtinë, and then you have things that you want to do, and then there's, and then there's crises. So, like the assassination of Count Komandandrini was a crisis. All of a sudden, that's what you do. We had a whole weekly plan, and then all of a sudden, that gets thrown out the window for this, or when there's a. So that's how it happened. And there were lots of organizations at the time, I remember. So there's confusions. So here was a confusion that took place. The Germans set up somewhere in Korisha, which is this village sort of on the way in, near Prizren. They'd set up a shooting range for their military. And so, because, the military has to continue to train and they do all this, right? So they have a shooting range. That's what you do. Military do things like that. And so all of a sudden one day, Fyaka Suroy is there. She was working for the World Bank Community Development Program at the time. And she was angry too, because she said, because the World Bank, this Community Development Program, like USAID had this rapid response program, they would go into villages and they'd meet, have several meetings with people, and they'd say, what kinds of things do you need? And how can we help restore kind of normal life? And so what they were going to do in Korisha, at the place where the Germans had put up the firing range, they were going to have a garbage dump. And there was a tremendous need for garbage dumps. I remember as you drove in to Prizren from Prishtinë, there was you'd see these plastic flags floating up. It was really unpleasant. And, no one's taking care of this stuff, right? Especially from March of 23rd, 99 to June 10th, there was nothing. And then when we came in, there was still nothing because there was no one yet, and it took us quite a while to build up. And so I went to many hours of meetings on garbage, for example. And so they wanted to put up a garbage dump, but it was there in the shooting range. And so that led to a week or two of talks between the Germans and the World Bank and all this. And yeah, it was really cool. Yeah, well, let's see.
And what did you do next? Or maybe do you want to still stay in this period?
Well, this was the end of my UN time, and that was the end of time here. And there were many things that we did. We brought in, one of the things that Komandandrini did with us was I have a friend, a Canadian, and I later went to work for them, for the Pearson Peacekeeping Center in Nova Scotia in Canada. And they had really tremendous programs where they would have these kind of executive level training programs. They did stuff, and they were trying to do stuff in the field. So this friend of mine said, well, we're getting into DDR, that is this disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs. And they're developing this whole program on DDR. I said, fantastic. And I said, would they want to come to Prizren? I'm just talking to a friend of mine there. He goes, I said, we can't pay for them, but if they came to Prizren, we would do everything, lots of in-kind support. So, PPC paid for them to come. We met them in Skopje, and then they came and they spent 2 or 3 weeks working with Komandandrini or Ekonom Regia with demobilized KLA guys and on things to do. So we did stuff like that. That was really a cool thing. And so, I don't know. But a lot of it was just trying to keep balls in the air while these broader systems were in place. And then, I don't know, the UN then did its things. Some of it really good, some of it not so good, as in different places.
Where did you leave? And where did you go from there?
So I left in November 2000, and I went to Canada. That's when I went to work for the PPC. Because after we did that, they invited me to to do a course on civil military cooperation. So I did a course, and then they were looking for someone to be a research director. I'm an academic by training, so it all kind of worked, and I went there. And so
How long did you stay there?
I was there for 2 years. I had other options that I might have done, and you sometimes wonder whether you make the right choice. And so, I could have gone down to Washington and done stuff there too, but at the time, so you were up in Dartmouth, right?
Yeah.
So Nova Scotia it's just further up.
Yeah.
And it was kind of, for someone who had been working in a war for several years, it seemed to be really like this idyllic place that turned out to be, I kind of wish I were in a city. I'm basically a city boy. But it was okay. It was nice.
Was it cold?
No, because they have the Gulf Stream comes up. So the line in Nova Scotia is, if you don't like the weather, wait for 10 minutes. So the winter is not too cold. The winter is, although, we would do these trainings and we'd bring in all these officers from Africa and Latin America right near the equator and in the middle of the winter time, and they didn't have warm jackets, so we would have to do stuff like that.
Was your family following you while they were based in the U.S.?
My family, they came to Zagreb, and then we moved to Osijek. They were with me in Osijek, and then in Sarajevo. And then one of the reasons I left is that there was really no place to bring them here. It wasn't really ready to bring them, and Suzanne didn't want to. A lot of people had their families in Skopje, and that meant so every Friday afternoon they would go to Skopje. But I'm the kind of person, when I worked 14 hours a day. And my idea of, and I often worked on weekends. And so what I did for a while in the fall of '99 is that every Sunday, a group of us would go out to a different village, and we'd go meet the people, and I would ask them, what was it like here during the war? And they would explain to me. And then I would tell them about what we were doing. This was all informal. I just did this because I was interested in doing it and trying to kind of promote the UN program. I deeply believe that we could succeed against all, like a second marriage. They say it's the triumph of hope over experience. I really, really believe that we could make it work. And so I was doing all that, and so I didn't want to have my family in Skopje. They didn't want to go. So they were in the States, and then when I got the job in Canada, we reunited. That was so I would go back to the States every, 6 weeks or so for 10 days.
And what happened with you between this period then? It's 2002 up to 2014, you said,
Yeah.
in Kosovo?
Yeah. Well, I was in Kosovo between then too. I did various things.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
I did an assessment of the judiciary in 2001. I was giving you some of the stuff. I have that for the Canadian government. That's been published on the World Bank Rule of Law website. I did a USAID. I was part of a team that did an assessment on the return of minorities to Kosovo. And on that, it's, the people that you work with, Enver Hoxha was part of that team.
Mhm.
So I got to know, I worked very closely with Enver for about 3 weeks on that in 2000. That must have been 2003. And
There's
then,
a lot of shortage of electricity. How did you even manage that while you were a municipal administrator?
oh, we had, yeah, that's a good point. There was, we had generators. In our headquarters, we had generators. I didn't in my house. I mean, I lived the winter of '99, 2000, which was a cold winter. I had no heat, no hot water. I took cold showers. For the winter in a house with no heat. I had blankets this thick. And I would come home, so I'd only come home to sleep. And I had a beautiful house. early on, I rented this really beautiful house. I had a roommate, also from the UN, and I would get into the covers, and it would take about 2 minutes, and then my body heat would keep me warm. And I'd get up, and I would take a shower every other day because it was incredibly painful, and I didn't really need it. And so it was cold. It was a really cold winter. But all the electricity we had in our headquarters, in our offices, and there was nothing. And other people I would visit, and he would invite me over and stuff. They had made all kinds of accommodations with stoves and things like that. But I didn't do it because I wasn't there to be at home. I mean, so I would get into work at 7:38 in the morning, and I would go home at 9, 10 at night. That was my daily routine. And then I had these little flashlights, and I would go to bed trying to read, and then and I'd fall asleep quickly. After a good evening with Sulio, Sulio would force me to drink scotch. And
there were many accidents at the time also because of the electricity shortage. Because of
there was stuff.
ways.
There were a lot of things that went on, and over time I forget some of the stuff. I know we had, it was it was a difficult time. Early on in the mission, we were all like one family because there weren't that many expats. We had a large national staff, and there was still the sense in which everyone we believed it could be successful, and so that we all lived our lives all together. But over time, the expats kind of wanted to separate themselves off, and that's around the time that I left. Anyways, that's around the time that I left. I wasn't particularly supportive of that, and I did believe that if you could identify the right kind of people to work with, and it didn't really matter. The right kind of people were the people who demonstrated that they were interested in doing the right things. That you really could do really good things. But there were lots of ways in which Prizren was just one little place. And the larger flow of events was being determined in Prishtinë.
Were you traveling in Prishtinë often?
Yeah, weekly. We would go to a weekly meeting. And at the time, sometimes it would take 2.5 hours. Because, you drive through the Dule Pass, and the roads were terrible, really bad. And then you would get behind these German military convoys. So you'd be going like 10, 15 kilometers an hour. And then when you get to Shtima, just holes, rivers, lakes in the roads. Suvareka had terrible roads at the time too. So it was just, we'd go to Prishtinë and we'd meet with but I became a real Prizrenac, My friends would say, I worked in Prishtinë for 20 years. I never once slept there, stuff like that. And I didn't, I felt at home in Prizren, and I didn't particularly like Prishtinë. And in Prizren, everyone, you couldn't, I speak Serbo-Croatian, and I would never go up to someone I didn't know and speak, and I would never go into a store and speak it. But, when you meet someone, et cetera, and you realize, well, that's the language you can communicate, you could do that really easily. But I would never do that in Prishtinë. I mean,
were you afraid that you would endanger somebody? Even in Prizren, if you talk to them in Serbo-Croatian?
I was threatened by some people who say, well, God, you're really brave to speak that language, people would say to me sometimes. People who wanted them to think that I was their friend, or they wanted to. There was a lot of trauma, which is understandable. And I've learned this especially since I've returned. You talk to people who are political prisoners, and then we met people there who did that as well. But just coming back, I met these guys at Martini one night, folk singers. And so they began singing for us, and we were talking, and so we could speak in Croatian, so we're speaking Croatian, and we spent the night, this is entirely by chance. And they began telling me what would happen to them in the 90s. They'd go out, and the policeman would see them, and just say, "What are you doing out?" "Oh, I'm just going here." "Okay, well, you know, they'd get beaten up, or they'd be taken to jail because they were breaking a curfew. There's all sorts of stuff like that. And I assume that that was not a unique case that happened. You know, I talked to someone who is influential now, told me when he was a kid in the 80s, late 80s, so this is even before this, he defaced something, you know, Tito Socialism Mir or something like that, you know, 4 years in jail for defacing. I mean, you know, it's not, he should have been fined somehow or made to do some whatever, but so, you know, there's stuff like that. And so there's just these traumas. And then you hear what happened in Krusha or what happened in Arahovats after the, you know, and so there's all these things. And so I don't, you know, and I know I went back, I organized the visit of the Iowa National Guard to the States. I did this the last 2 years. And Ukshin Hoti's daughter was my student. And so when I did this, I wanted to take them to Krusha to meet. So there's this amazing, you know the story that woman-led business where they make ivory. It's fantastic. It's a tremendous story on so many levels. And so, but I hadn't been in Krusha since 2000, 99, 2000. And I went, and Brazilda arranged for me to meet her uncle, who was someone, and then I met the guy who's now the head of the village. And they came up to me and said, you know, Mr. Baskin, they go, I remember I talked to you in 1999. And, you know, I remember going there, and there was still really early on when ICTY was here doing investigations and about these kind of massacres and stuff. And people remember that, so these people that remember me remember that I was this sort of sense of stability and kind of positive thing. And so that's kind of nice. But the sense of trauma was really great. So it was in that sense, it was a difficult time. It was a difficult time, you know, it was for them and for you all in particular, because, and anyway.
No, I mean, was it difficult to present certain ideas that are more inclusive and that kind of imagine others as well, others non-Albanians, or you weren't doing that at the time? You were just...
We tried to do it. I mean, I had a guy, I mean, in the municipality of Prizren, so I was a municipal administrator. I had 3 vice presidents. One was Albanian. Well, just to, you know, to give that, it was very Titoist, you know. I had an Albanian, I had a Turk, and I had a Bosniak. And the Albanian and the Turk had known each other for a long time, and you know they were both part of, you know, active. My Turkish guy was, you know, he was a political prisoner in the 90s and all this. And this guy Sezer Shaipi is his name. He was a great guy. And I wanted to find a Bosniak, and so I had, you know, I had these 2 contending political parties. They wanted to be the one. And I decided I don't want either of them because we're going to be apolitical. So I asked the people I was working with, I said, we need to find somebody who is a Bosniak, who gets along well with everybody. And if they can speak Albanian, it would be fantastic. And they found someone. Some guy who had worked at Balkan. He was from Župa Valley. And he was great. He was really good. And so, you know, so that was the kind of the way that we tried to get stuff done. And, you know, you can kind of see in Prizren the way in which Yugoslavia sort of worked.
How so?
Well, so I had friends who would say, there are three of us. Two were Albanian, and one was a Turk. And they were all the same generation. And they said, one of them went to the Turkish high school, one of them went to the Albanian high school, one of them went to the Serbian high school. And one of them went to university in Zagreb, one of them went to university in Belgrade, I think. Two of them went to Zagreb. Not sure where Vucko went, but Vucko's brother went to Belgrade. And, they were citizens. They were all kind of urban city people, and so that they were part of that kind of elite group. But there was a real sense of civic pride. There was a real sense that, and they were open in many ways. And so I just thought that, I don't know.
When did you come back to really move in? Back?
Oh, 2014. Yeah.
Since then you've been here constantly?
Yeah, well, I leave, but yeah, I've been living here since 2014. And
how did you decide?
Got a job.
Okay.
I mean, I was at a point I spent, after I left, so just quickly from my biography, after I left Canada, I went to work and I moved, my ex-wife's from upstate New York, around Schenectady, Albany region. And so we just bought a house. And I got a job at the State University of New York in Albany, and where I worked for about, I don't know, till I left, doing international development stuff. And then I was also teaching in the political science department. And with state universities, budgeting is always an exciting thing. And so I'm not sure how much longer I could have stayed on doing that. But I was like, and the job, so I began looking around for work, and I got this job, which is where I met you originally, and then I moved over to AUK.
When you're doing these teaching jobs, does this experience inform the way you design courses? How do you integrate it into it?
So when I came back, I was a full-time academic before I went to work for the UN, and what I teach is completely different now. The only course that I continue to teach, and I didn't do this at Albany, they didn't want me to teach this course. That was comparative politics, like an introduction to comparative politics. But when I was at Albany, I was teaching courses on post-conflict reconstruction. I was teaching courses on war and peace. I did something on ethnic conflict, which I had never really taught before. Whereas before I would teach courses on, because I was just trained to do Soviet studies, I would teach courses on Soviet foreign, Russian foreign policy, Russian-American relations, comparative politics. And then I was teaching at this really small school where you could do whatever you want. So I taught a course, and they wouldn't let me teach it at Albany, a course on political film, which I love teaching the course on political film. And so then when I've been here, I taught what they needed. And so I've taught a course on global political economy, comparative politics, public policy, which I had taught in the old days as well. And I teach a course on Balkan history. It didn't work. I wanted to bring you in. Maybe this year if I teach it again, because they did oral history. I gave them it turned out to be a really good assignment. I think, some of the kids, they don't get interested in anything, but some of the kids really got off on it, I asked them to study, to ask people over a certain age their memories of socialism.
Okay.
And some kids really got into it. And it's really quite interesting how you can really look into the social backgrounds of your students when you read this assignment. So.
And you've been teaching only, or so how was this USAID project for you? You were giving scholarships?
Yeah, we're giving scholarships, and it was okay. It was fine, but in the end, I left that, and
it was quite open as a program, if I recall. It wasn't just.
It was, but the problem, this gets into a much different conversation about the nature of development and the nature of development assistance, and we've given you so many billions of dollars. And then when you think about, of the billions of dollars that the EU and different governments have given, how much of that money goes to salaries of people like me? How much of that money actually goes to programming? And when it turns out, I worked on USAID projects for many years. It turns out that like 10, 20% actually goes to projects, to programs. The rest of it goes to all sorts of other kind of stuff. And you can say, okay, it's good, it's fine, but is it? And and so this program ended up sending you, and you're a great example, because you went and you did this, and now you're doing something that's really cool, and that's useful, and that's important to hear, and that ought to, in some ways, in some other country, it could be part of the University of Prishtinë. Depending, and maybe that still could, depending on how things evolve, in the sense that because, there are all these things, and I'm sure you know about this, and the National Public Radio has these various archives. People tell their stories. It's a similar kind of thing, and it's a really tremendous resource. But a lot of people come, we sent people off. This was supposed to be a practical program. So we sent people off to study things that weren't necessarily so practical. And then people then go study one thing and they come back and they don't really. So it's really hard to say. And on the other hand, I think it's always a good idea that people can go. I think the programs that we sent people to were pretty good programs, and the people did well, and so that it's always good to enhance the capacity of people. But I'm thinking, for example, someone like, I'm thinking of someone of your cohort who then went to work for the foreign minister, Dhe Sérgio. Yeah. But he's not the only one that went. He did a master's degree at Denver, which is a great school, and now he's privatizing, or he's not working for the government anymore, and that's unfortunate. Someone of his capacity. But that's just one case, and because I know him a little bit, so that's how I know that. So you try to feed it back. And by the way, the program that we ran, it's similar to all the universities. I sent a student this year who's now up in Brussels studying, getting a master's degree in Leuven, actually in Leuven. And when he comes back, he's going to have to work, he's supposedly going to have to work for the government for 2 or 3 years. Yeah.
That's scheme.
Yeah. That's a good scheme. Although in his case, we want to send him to the States to do a doctorate in history, but because he would like to, but we'll see. He's still young.
How do you make sense of your life here in this last chapter?
So for me, it's my own personal thing is that, it was serendipity brought me to the Balkans in 1975. And I didn't know anything really about Yugoslavia at the time or anything like that. And yet I've sort of become I feel very local in a way, even though I'm not. I know I'm not. And so for me, I feel I can't imagine doing anything that's more personally fulfilling than what I'm doing now, both teaching and whatever consulting I do, work I do. And so, I think that this isn't the only place that has been rent and destroyed by war and conflict and all this. There's plenty of places all over the world where things are really horrible. And so, but this happens to be the place, and I have this desire to kind of try to improve the the world I live in. And so this is the place that I'm at, and I'm trying to make whatever small contribution is pretty small.
How's your work with students here? Like, anything in particular? Is it any different than the US?
Yes. I used to say no, but it is different. Starting off is that because, we teach in English, and people here are poor, and I give my kids several $100s a semester to buy books. You can spend $200 for books on one course in the States. So that you can spend as much as $700 or $800 on a course. We can't do that here. And then, of course, and it's not a trend, I haven't taught in the US now for a few years, but people don't read much anymore. And so getting students, and at the end of the day, it's important to read. There's different ways of bringing in information, and reading is a very effective way of one aspect of learning. And so that's a difficult challenge. I have some students who are as good, are among the very best students I've ever taught since the 1980s. It's really true. I'm not just saying that. But then I have the master students that sort of are not among the very best students I've taught. And so there's that. And but overall, and then you see things, I see things here that, I guess in the States we had it, like at AUK you see that you have like friends. There's a couple of boys that take all their classes together, or a couple of girls that take all their classes together. And so you have this sort of thing, that there's this there's a whole social dimension which a good anthropologist, a good ethnographer can really get into in a way. And so, yeah.
No, how would you describe maybe, not the difference, because that would require something very short, but how do you make sense of 2000 and 2020 now? How does it make sense where we at for you, for the society you live in, and where you started off and where you're?
So in 2000, when I came in here, everyone was hopeful. Everyone. Everyone was hopeful. I didn't deal with the Serb community, but they were not very hopeful, I would say, in 2000. But everyone else I dealt with was hopeful and believed that things would be a lot better. And now, I would say everyone's not hopeful, that there's still some hope. That the amount of hope has gone down, that people are a little more jaded. And I would say this, and I would say in part, it would be a mistake to expect Kosovo to have developed at the maximum level of its potential, because no place does. And you look at the evolution of European societies, or America, or the United States, it took several hundred years for us to become democratic. And it wasn't only because we had never figured it out, but it was just because over generations, it takes sometimes a whole generation for people to change how they do things. And it's just a question of a cultural change. And so that takes a long time. And so that I don't see any reason why we should expect everyone here to be so much better than we were. And that's kind of what we're expecting of you when we say that. And so then I look at, and I know a lot of people here, and people who are in all the political parties and different governments and stuff. And so some people feel that they're more virtuous than others, that they're criminals and we're not. And I think that I look at the United States, and I look at the kind of legislation that was passed in the 1780s and 90s, and then you look at the way the various financial scandals in the United States throughout our history, and you look at the way in which the Rockefeller The Rockefeller brothers, what a virtuous organization. How did the Rockefellers make their money? They were called robber barons. So why should we expect people here to be somehow, to avoid the mistakes that others have made? And so to me, so that in some broader sense, I remain incredibly optimistic. And I think at each moment we need to kind of act. And there are traditions here that are not necessarily conducive to the development of a British American style liberal democracy. I mean, this was part of the Ottoman Empire, you know, et cetera. You look at, I went back and read all this medieval history when I began teaching the Balkan study class, and you go back to the Byzantine, you look at just the administrative units going back to Byzantine times to the present, very little has changed. You change the names of them, but you know, they used to have these things, you know, the vilayets evolved out of the Byzantine form of organization. And so why should things be so much different now? And so that to the extent, and I do believe that democracy, liberal democracy, if it can work, is a pretty good system, because it allows individuals to rise and fall and all of this, and that but when we see the challenges that we face in my country right now, and it's difficult to maintain those those institutions in those ways, and so as I look at the track record here, it's easy to say there's this blame game that goes on, that people here blame the internet, the EU and the UN for all this terrible stuff. But the UN and the EU had tremendous success. We had tremendous failures too, but there are many things that we did that was successful. And it's easy to point to all the things that we did wrong. It's easy to point to ways in which we formed relationships that might not have been all that well. But, you know, virtue is not necessarily so virtuous. Robespierre, he was acting in the name of virtue. So it's important to, you know, we don't want to kill everybody. So I think things are okay. I think over the long run, I think that, and so much of what happens here will depend on forces that are entirely out of the control of people here. It entires on, you know, what the relations between China, Russia, UN, all that sort of broader things provides a certain context. And I think that I'm hopeful that we'll continue to be moving up, and that the new government will have some success. Yeah, so what happened was, we're there, and then sometime in the late summer of '99, this guy who worked for the American Jewish Distribution Committee, I forgot his name now, darn it. I can remember and tell you. And he came to Prizren, and they wanted to celebrate, they wanted to have a Rosh Hashanah dinner. And he had known somehow that I was Jewish. And he had known about Votim Demiri, who's now president of and you know, Votim was a prominent personality in Prizren even before. And Eli Eliezer was his name. He was an Israeli, Eli Eliezer. And so Eli said, come on. He was one of these kind of really upbeat Israelis, you know, just total energy. And we had this dinner where we had Votim, and I think, you know, Votim's family, and then there's a few others. And it turned out there were sort of 2 or 3 bigger Jewish kind of families in Prizren. And there was a bunch that had made Aliyah in 47, 48 from Prizren. So there was a kibbutz or something. There were Bosnian Jews in Israel, and I think there were some Kosovo Jews as well. And I know some Croatian Jews, so through a friend of mine who told me his really good friend. So, and so we had this dinner, and to me, it was totally bizarre. And he all of a sudden, Eli calls this guy who had been an Israeli minister of education, who was involved in something, I think some Geneva process or something. And he says, sure, you should talk with him. And so we're talking about Kosovo and all this. And then Eli was telling me that he thought it was important that they wanted to be there, And they wanted to be there in part to show, that because there was a Jewish community and that they wanted to give them support, but they also wanted to work among the many things that the American Jewish Distribution Committee does, and they're all over, was they were putting computers in schools, and then he told me that they were helping to rebuild a mosque, or they wanted to. And the idea was that what we want to do is to create a multi-ethnic, kind of thing that we want to, and he did it for explicit political reasons, was this idea that in a place like that, a minority is not protected. So that was kind of cool. And then for Passover the next year, did you ever go to a Passover Seder?
I did.
That's great, because they always end up next year in Jerusalem. And so Passover Seder, which tells the story of the Jews, escape from Egypt. So for Passover, we had a much bigger thing. And again, all of our friends, all the people I was friends with, we brought in. And Eli would always get all the expat Jews to come to these events. And so we did it at some restaurant or something in Prizren, and he had some Albanian Jew, a Jewish woman from Albania who had moved to Israel. And then we did a small little Seder, and then she talked about what it was like being Jewish in Albania, et cetera, and all that. So that's kind of what we did at the end. And I know that Eli very much, and so Vatim saw that at the end that would be his way of working, and his daughter Ines, who works in at the consulate in New York, and she's now very active. And so one time, and so about a year or so ago, I was in Liburnia, and then Ines came in with Tevta Sahatia and all these kind of Jews from New York and Israel, and so we reconnected, and I know they want to build a Jewish community center in Prizren, and in a way, I think it's, there are very few Jews left in Kosovo, and so I think I mentioned this the other day. I go to Torah study when I'm back in the States, and I was thinking when I'm done with this event, I wanted to say, well, we should have Torah study. It's a really incredibly engaging thing intellectually, and but I don't think there's much interest in that. But the thing about creating a Jewish community center here is that it would commemorate the community that existed. And it would demonstrate the way in which Kosovo is home to all communities here. And that there is that cemetery up, in Tokpashe or wherever that is, near that area. And I think that a Jewish community center can be a place where there can be, it can be a kind of a temple of tolerance. Now, who knows what'll really happen? I mean, I know that in places like Zagreb, I used to go to these things in Zagreb for Rosh Hashanah and stuff. And the Zagreb Jewish community and the Belgrade Jewish community have both split. We say if you have two Jews, three political parties. And so there's, but I actually think that it's a nice idea in that. And having it in Prizren rather than Prishtinë is also a nice idea, because it brings people there, and that Prizren, at least the marker of its identity, in very explicitly is as a multi-ethnic community and all that. So I think
Do
that's.
you have an insight how they cultivate this sense of Jewishness? How did they reconnect to that heritage?
I think that there's been some financing from international Jewish organizations to have some. I know when I was in the States and I wasn't able to travel, they had a big event that they invited me to, and I never went to. There was some big 3-day conference, and they're rekindling it now. And because to be Jewish is a matrilineal thing. And I know a lot of people who are active in the Zagreb Jewish communities whose fathers were Jewish and mothers weren't, but they were still active. And the Orthodox rabbis in Israel would not accept them, but that we off their name is Sternberg will say they're Jewish, you know. And so I don't know. I do think that if there's going to be a vital community, that there would need to be some slight, you know, in Sarajevo, we used to go to services where there'd be a real Rosh Hashanah, there'd be a Seder, where you're doing it in the proper way, you know, where at least the ritual is done. You know, there's a wide variety of how the ritual can be done for each of these, so that they should do it in some way. In fact, I'm going to be in touch with because Passover's coming up in another month, so we'll see if we'll do a Seder together.
Well, I think we should.
Thanks for coming. It's been,
Thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure. It's been nice to reconnect.